All right, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining the Pollinator Steward webinar series. This is webinar number 3, Beautiful Butterflies with James Miskelly. And I'll start here with just a few minutes of introductions and then we'll get to the presentation. So this webinar series has been created by Pollinator Partnership Canada, along with partners, Habitat Acquisition Trust, Saanich Native Plants, and Parks Canada. My name is Paige, and I'm the Stewardship Coordinator at HAT, and I'm here with some fellow partners. I'm going to name them, and then they'll take a moment to introduce themselves. So we'll start with Dr. Laura Mirandin.
Thanks, Paige. Yeah, I'm Laura Mirandin. I'm the Acting Director for Pollinator Partnership Canada and the Research Director for Pollinator Partnership Canada and the U.S. parent organization Pollinator Partnership. We're the largest organization in the world dedicated exclusively to the protection of pollinators and their habitat. And we do that through research, outreach and education, collaboration, policy advising, habitat creation. We have quite a few free resources on our websites if you want to check those out for helping you learn how to conserve pollinators. And yeah, we're really excited to be here and to be working with HAT and Saanich Native Plants and Parks Canada to bring you this webinar series. We really appreciate all of you being here. And yeah, looking forward to this webinar by James.
Thanks, Laura. So next we're going to go to Amy Peltier.
Hello, bonjour. My name is Amy Peltier, and I work with Parks Canada as a Species at Risk Engagement Officer. Parks Canada is very happy to partner on this initiative. Locally, we work at Fort Rod Hill National Historic Site in Colwood, and then also at Gulf Islands National Park Reserve. And yeah, we are engaged in Garry Oak and coastal sand ecosystem restoration in the region, and in particular, the recovery of rare plant species.
Awesome, thanks, Amy. And then we're going to go to Kristen Miskelly.
Thanks, Paige. I'm Kristen Miskelly with Saanich Native Plants. So James and myself co-founded the nursery. And our nursery is passionate about providing native plants and seeds, native seeds, as well as education to a variety of different people so that they can go forward with projects where they might need native plants and seeds. And to learn more about us, just go ahead and visit our website at saanichnativplants.com, and it'll be good to see you there. And thanks so much for being here now.
Great, thanks, Kristen. And we are also joined by our speaker, of course, James Miskelly, and I will introduce him closer to the end of this little intro, right when we get started here. So mentioned all of our partners, and we're also going to take a moment to recognize we're chatting about butterflies and their interactions with plants. And these are intricate and ancient relationships, and protecting them is essential. It is also important at all times to be aware that these creatures are part of stewarded First Nations territories and are considered relatives to Coast Salish people in our area. These nations include the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nation, or the Lekwungen speaking peoples, the Chiana First Nation, with several languages in their community, the Sauk Nation, as well as the 5 Saanich Nation, or yeah, 5 with Saanich Nations, the Hakwachen, Sayout, Sartlip, Sekum, and the Malahat First Nation. So opportunities for education about plants and animals like this one today is a real honor for all of us. And we hope there is appreciation and stewardship garnered for nature through raising awareness, like with this webinar. So we want to thank you all for coming. And next we're going to thank our funders. So we have several sponsors that are making it possible to provide this series free of charge for you participants. And in addition to Pollinator Partnership Canada and HAT and Saanich Native Plants, as well as Parks Canada, we have Whole Foods, Van City, and the Growing Together initiative that have all provided funds to support the series. We're very grateful. So this series includes 10 webinars, but maybe more. Laura will tell us that, I think. And information on each webinar can be found at the Island Pollinator Initiative website. It's right on the page there. We are sequentially conducting them over the summer and the fall of this year. They'll be around every 1 to 2 weeks, and registration will be open a few weeks prior to the date of the webinar. So recordings of the webinar will also be available after each one is completed. So you can see we've got several webinars that are still upcoming as well. And I'm just gonna go back. Oh yeah. Yes, and like one of the other features we have is the Certified Pollinator Steward process, which is part of an amazing initiative by Pollinator Partnership. And you can go to the islandpollinator-initiative.ca to find out more about that process. So it shows that you have a science-based understanding of pollinators and pollinator conservation, and that you've taken action to help pollinators. Again, just see the IPI page for more info. There is a list of people who are interested, so you can also email Laura at lm@pollinator.org. Okay. So moving into, oh, there's a strange order of my slides, but that's okay. So moving into the logistics for today's webinar, let me just make sure I have. Yes, here we go. Sorry about that, folks. I'm just going to change this up. Bear with me here. I think I have a old version here. Okay. So let's see. Sadly, my screen is eluding me. Okay. Well, the important part is that you can see this lovely portion. So I want to take a minute to acknowledge and go through the logistics for today's talk, and then James's presentation will be much more coordinated than mine. So the presentation portion will run till about 2 p.m. and then we'll have 20 minutes for a Q&A. There will be about 20 to 30 minutes, and then we are, I'll be monitoring some of the Q&A as well as a few other folks. We'll get through as many questions as we can, but note that you're able to change your view of the webinar and speaker layout through your webinar controls. So feel free to use the chat function to speak with one of us if you have questions or issues. Yeah, and anytime you're welcome to ask a question through that function. We're also going to be giving away 2 prizes at the end. Oh my gosh, I'm so excited this is working again. And, oops, there we go. So the moderator's favorite question choice award will be receiving these beautiful blank note cards or greeting cards from Pollinator Partnership, and that'll be at the end of the webinar. So that'll be the moderator, which is myself and actually a few others. So pick one of them great questions, it's, you know, and then we're gonna pick a recipient. And then the other prize or award is actually from James himself. And this is a beautiful book that he's put together with Mike Yip, and you can see the photo of them there. And it's really nice color photos and descriptions, and he'll talk a little bit more about the book towards the end of his presentation. I will note that it is for pickup only, so you will need to come to Saanich Native Plants Nursery to pick it up. Yeah, so from there, we are going to talk about the wonderful James Miskelly. So I'm just going to take a moment to introduce James, and then he'll take over from there. So James Miskelly is a biologist and butterfly extraordinaire guru. So he's a research associate in entomology at the Royal BC Museum and a native plant enthusiast. His graduate research was related to the habitat requirements of rare butterflies. James leads native seed production at Saanich Native Plants and also works full-time for Natural Resources Canada. James has been active in Garry Oak ecosystem conservation for a long time and was a member of the Kosiwik Arthropods Committee for 11 years. And James is going to take it away from here.
All right. Thanks, Paige.
No problem. Okay.
So, does it look like it should? Okay.
James,
Thanks.
can you hear me?
Yeah.
You're a little bit dark there. If you could, do you have a light or open up a drape or something, or no?
No.
Okay.
So thanks everybody for coming. So here's what we're going to be talking about for the next hour-ish. This is going to be a mainly Vancouver Island, southeastern Vancouver Island focused presentation. But for those of you who are tuned in from other places, I hope that you'll find something interesting in there. I'm going to talk just briefly about what are butterflies and a little bit about history and conservation in our area. Specific notes about the butterflies of BC and Vancouver Island, how to identify at least some broad groups of butterflies, and where to find them or how to look for them. So the first question is, what are butterflies? Well, of course, butterflies are insects, and insects as a group are divided into a whole bunch of subgroups called orders. And depending on which classification scheme you use, there's close to 30 different orders of insects. So for example, beetles are an order, flies are an order, and butterflies belong to the order Lepidoptera, and that order includes all butterflies and moths. And so the question that a lot of people often have on their mind, a question that I get a lot, is what is the difference between a butterfly and a moth? And I think that a lot of people are imagining a family tree that looks something like this, with a very clear distinction between these two different groups. And that isn't really the case. The Lepidoptera family tree looks more like this. And so these are all superfamilies within the order Lepidoptera. And of this, there's about I think it's 17,500 species or so. And about 10% of those are in this superfamily right here, which is the group that we call the butterflies. And everything else we call moths. It is currently National Moth Week, so I should give a shout out to moths here. You can see, you know, extraordinary diversity. This is a very complex family tree with a huge number of species. And if we look at the butterflies more specifically, as in terms of how they fit into this whole picture, then we see that butterflies and inchworm moths here are two branchlets on one branch. And so those are relatively close relations, whereas inchworm moths and clothes moths are not so closely related. So moths aren't really a cohesive monolithic group. Moths are a hugely diverse and complex group. And within that group, the butterflies are just one branchlet on one branch. But that doesn't really get to the point of the question. When people are saying, what's the difference between a butterfly and a moth? I guess they're meaning, when I look at something, how can I tell what it is? And within this superfamily that we call the butterflies, there's a lot of different variation in appearance. You know, they're not all colorful. They don't all hold their wings in a certain way or anything like that. But one thing that you can use, especially in the temperate zone, is that all butterflies in our area have clubbed antennae. So there, you can see on this picture that every one of these animals have antennae that end in a little expanded club. And no moths in BC have that. All moths will have either antennae that is thread-like the whole way to the end, or else antenna that is sort of feathery or comb-like. So that's one thing that you can use to see whether you're looking at a butterfly or a moth. Or maybe by the end of this presentation, you'll be able to just recognize all the families of butterflies, and then you'll know that anything you don't recognize must be a moth. In BC, there's about 190 butterfly species. And so that's about 10%, or sorry, 1% of all the butterfly species in the world. But it's more than 60% of all the butterfly species in Canada. So a very large share of all of Canada's butterfly diversity. I should point out that some species are very widespread. So it's not like the rest of the country only has less than 40%. There are many provinces that have more than 50% of Canada's butterfly species. And I believe this brings us to our first poll. If we have 190-ish butterfly species spread across the whole province of BC, the first poll asks, approximately how many species of butterflies do you think can be found on Vancouver Island? So including everything that's ever been found here. Do you think it's about 1 to 10 species, or maybe up to 30, up to 60, up to 90, or more than that?
So we have about 75% now that have voted. So I'll just give it another 10 seconds or so here. Okay, we're up over 80, almost 90% of people have voted now. Okay, so I'll stop that poll now and you can see the result.
So we have, everybody knows that there are more than 10 species on Vancouver Island. 13% of people suggested between 10 and 30 species. The plurality of people, 36%, chose 30 to 60 species, and then we have about a quarter each for 60 to 90 or 90 plus. So the correct answer is, if you take all the butterflies that have ever been found on Vancouver Island, including some that might be rare migrants and some that haven't been seen here for a long time, the answer is 70 species. And so, you know, with 190 species in BC, it's a big and complex province, and Vancouver Island is just a small part of it. But here we have, or potentially have, at least a third of all the butterfly species in BC. So that's pretty good. Of course, butterfly species are not distributed evenly. And so let's have a look at where in the province they are concentrated. So on this figure, the redder and darker the square is, the more butterfly species have been found in that square. So there's a few things to look at here. First of all, there are butterflies found virtually everywhere in the province, you know, at some level. Second thing to see is that the places that have the highest butterfly diversity are places that have really, stark habitat gradients across small areas. So the hot valleys of southern BC, where you can have an arid valley bottom and then potentially have mountain meadows and alpine peaks in the same square, those have the most butterfly species. Now, if you have a look at southeastern Vancouver Island, where your webinar is coming from today, you can see it's not the most diverse place in the whole province, but it's pretty good. And one important thing to note is how different it is from the rest of coastal BC. And this is important because butterflies have a really hard time with cool, wet climates. For whatever reason, those conditions just don't work well for butterflies. So you could go, you know, you can see up in far northwestern BC, you can see a really nice red square at Atlin. So lots of diversity there where it's very cold but very dry. And then if you went down to a tropical rainforest, of course, you'd find incredible diversity in a place that's very wet but very warm. When you combine wet and cool, very few butterflies can take that. And so there aren't a lot of butterfly species on BC's outer coast, but there are quite a lot on the east side of Vancouver Island. And that's because in a lot of ways, the Salish Sea and the surrounding area is kind of like an interior valley that happens to be full of seawater, but our vegetation is very different from the rest of the coast. Our climate is very different. And particularly on southeastern Vancouver Island, where we have and historically had a lot more of all of these open meadowlands, oak savannas, dry open Douglas fir forest. And we actually know a fair bit about what the butterfly fauna of southeastern Vancouver Island was like in the very early days of colonization. And I can read you a few things here. Oh, before I get to that, let's talk a little bit about what kind of species we find here. And so these maps come from Chris Guppy and John Shepard's 2001 book, and they're also The Butterflies of BC, and they're also available on eFauna. And so I'll just show you a few examples of some different distribution patterns that local butterflies follow. So this is an example of a species that is found on southern Vancouver Island because it's found absolutely everywhere in BC, a very widespread species, the mourning cloak. Here's a western tiger swallowtail, a species that is not nearly so widespread, but is found all across southern BC. The western-tailed blue, this is a really common distribution pattern that you'll see in a lot of different species that's very widespread in interior BC, but virtually absent from the whole coast except for the east side of Vancouver Island. And then we also have a few species like the Propertius dusky wing, who just sort of, we're at the northern limit of their range, and in BC, their range is largely or wholly limited to southeastern Vancouver Island. And so let's look a little bit more closely at historical records of some of these. And we have written records going back to 1884, when the Reverend George Taylor wrote this little piece about the entomology of Vancouver Island in the Journal of the Entomological Society of Canada. And it's just a short 1.5 pager that's supposed to cover all insects, which is kind of a tall order. But the most interesting to me part of it is one of the things that he really wants you to know. He says, several points about our insect fauna cannot fail to strike an observer. In the first place, the extreme abundance of butterflies. Nearly 40 species may be marked abundant, and he italicized the word abundant. He goes on to say something like, a patch of blossom in May covered with blues and fritillaries with an occasional sulfur and 2 or 3 swallowtail species is a sight that the English naturalist would never see at home, and that later in the year the hundreds of ladies, coppers, admirals, and skippers make a different but not less beautiful picture. So very flowery language and a very kind of, to my eye, mind's eye, shocking view of what Victoria once looked like. 10 years later, I think Danby, he visited Vancouver Island from New York, and he spent a year collecting here. And he made a list of all the species that he saw. And beside each species name, he wrote words like scarce, rare, common. And he wrote the word common beside 40 species. So agreeing with Taylor's observations from 10 years earlier. And to kind of better sort of calibrate your mind to what he might have meant when he said the word common, that paper also includes this passage. Lorquin's admiral and pine white were very numerous in certain localities, especially along the Cowichan River, upon the surface of which were thousands of dead individuals of both species. So when he uses the word common, he's not using it in the same way that we use it now. When what we call common now, he might have been calling, scarce. And then after that, about 7 years after that, again referring mostly to pine whites, I have this one from Fletcher. In August, the dead butterflies may be seen in vast numbers floating on the sea around Vancouver Island, or thrown up on the beach in windrows, sometimes an inch or 2 in depth. So very impressive butterfly numbers at the turn of the last century, something that's totally unlike the picture that we see today. In fact, Jeff Scudder, when he made that previous map that I showed of butterfly diversity, also mapped where the hotspots for rarity were. And this is what that map looks like. And so he identified, as the main places where our rarest butterfly species come from. He identified a few places in the Okanagan and Similkameen valleys, and then a whole bunch of southeastern Vancouver Island. And the reasons for that are pretty clear. If you live here or you've been here, all of those expansive meadowlands and oak woodlands and open forests and wetlands that were here at the time of colonization were quickly converted to farmland. Now most of that farmland has been converted to urban and suburban sprawl, and so it's just largely a matter of habitat destruction, unfortunately. And to understand this better, it's good to remind ourselves about the butterfly life cycle. So every butterfly in the world, every moth in the world has this same 4-part life cycle. And they have to go through every stage. And if they die in any stage, the cycle is broken. And so we start with the thing that we picture when we hear the word butterfly, the adult organism, the winged flying thing. And that lays an egg. The egg hatches into a caterpillar. In our area, all butterfly caterpillars eat plant materials. There are carnivorous caterpillars in the world, but none of them in our area. The caterpillar's only job is to eat and grow. When it's finished eating and growing, it transforms into the chrysalis or pupa, and whose job is to just rearrange all the tissues and make all of that material that the caterpillar has built into a butterfly. And then out of that comes the adult that we know to start the cycle again. So the important thing here is that every stage in this cycle has its own needs and its own vulnerabilities. And the great majority of butterflies in BC and on Vancouver Island are resident species, non-migratory species. So they're out there 365 days of the year. You know, when it's January or December and it's like windy and raining and 2 degrees, and you would think no butterfly could possibly survive this. But almost all of our local butterflies are out there in those conditions. They might be eggs, they might be caterpillars, they might be pupae, and there are even a few species who spend the winter hibernating as adults. And so every stage has its own needs and its own vulnerabilities. You know, the adult, all it needs is to stay alive, to feed itself, to find a mate. And everybody knows that butterflies feed on nectar from flowers, but not all of them really do all that much. Most of them do, but some of them very rarely visit flowers and are more likely to be found on things like rotten fruit or sap flows or animal droppings. Some of them visit flowers, but also really like to visit the edges of puddles where there might be a lot of minerals dissolved in the water. You can even sometimes see them licking at the edges of tide pools on the coast. And so the adult butterfly is in many ways the one that has the least specific requirements. And it's in many ways also the one that's in the least danger because it's the only one that can fly away from danger. What the egg needs is to be laid in the right place, which means in most cases it means being laid on or near the host plant, the plant that the caterpillars eat. And it needs to basically be safe from predators or lawnmowers or various other things that might just wipe that egg out. The caterpillar, its main thing that it needs is its host plant, the plant that it eats. Some species can be somewhat generalistic in which plants the caterpillars will eat, but most species are quite specific to a small group of plants that will usually share similar chemistry. And so the caterpillar needs that plant, and it needs that plant to be available and edible for as long as it wants to eat. And so some species run into problems if the plant dries up too early in the summer. Some species run into problems if somebody mows that plant or if a deer cuts it down or different things. And then the caterpillar turns into the pupa, and all the pupa needs is to be safe, to not get eaten by a predator or stepped on or composted or anything like that. Some features of butterfly habitat. Good butterfly habitat in our area is sunny and warm. All of the butterflies in BC and on southern Vancouver Island are species of sunshine. Some of them won't fly through shady areas. Some of them will fly through shady areas to get, to find the resources that they need, but very few of them would ever kind of like just stop and hang out in the shade, the way that they'll stop and hang out and bask in the sun. Good butterfly habitat has a high diversity of native plants, especially host plants. So again, the host plants are the plants that the caterpillars eat, and we'll say a few more words about host plants in a few minutes. Should have a lot of structural diversity. You know, anytime that your eye can pick up on diversity, then that's going to translate into biological diversity for butterflies and for other species. And good butterfly habitat minimizes direct threats to butterflies. And so some people, you know, want to have butterfly habitat in their yard, but they also want to, you know, weed whack it and mow it and break up their leaves and or maybe spray, things like that. And so that's not good butterfly habitat. Some common threats to butterflies on Vancouver Island specifically: invasive plants, especially shrubs and grasses. Invasive shrubs like Scotch broom can just totally transform an ecosystem. So that was once a meadow is not a meadow at all anymore, and all of the meadow associated vegetation and the species that depend on them are gone. Invasive grasses are also a big issue in our area, displacing native grasses, changing the structure, outcompeting some of the forbs and other host plants. Trampling and mowing are also both things that simplify plant communities and also pose direct threats to eggs and larvae and pupae. Succession, encroachment, that's one that I'll say a few words about in a second here. Deer may seem like a small thing, but the concentration of deer on southeastern Vancouver Island and the Gulf Islands has gotten to the point where it's actually a significant threat to other species. And I've seen several locations where very rare butterflies were eliminated because the host plants that the eggs and caterpillars were on were eaten. And in our area, also gypsy moth control can be a significant threat, very complicated threat because we don't want gypsy moths either. But the biological insecticide that is used to control gypsy moth is certainly fatal to all other lepidopterans who are actively feeding at the time that it gets sprayed. Just want to dwell for a second on this third to last point here, the succession and encroachment, because this is a big deal on southern Vancouver Island. And it's a big deal in a lot of other places as well. And I'll get to that in a second. But first, everybody wants to know, what can you do? Can support habitat protection and restoration, as I'll discuss in a second. Provide butterfly habitat at your home and learn about local butterflies and their needs. Now, these are two related points. You know, the first step always should be, you know, figure out what lives in your neighborhood, figure out what their host plants are, what kind of habitats they like, what their life cycles are like, where they might be at the times of year that you're not seeing them. And then those are all good clues to the kind of landscape features that you might incorporate or exaggerate on your own, in your own yard, in your garden, in a planter box, hanging out of your window, whatever kind of space you have, to just, you know, provide a little bit more host plant and a little bit more potential habitat. I'll say more about host plants in a second, but first of all, this first point, support habitat protection and restoration. This is an important point, and it's related to the succession issue that I was talking about earlier. Habitat protection, of course, is the most important thing that can be done for butterflies and for any other aspect of biodiversity. But with butterflies in particular, it often isn't enough. Here's a collection of photos of the Victoria area from the 1800s. And so you can see that these are kind of examples of what the landscape looked like at the time that those incredible historical accounts of butterfly abundance and diversity were written. So you see, bits of forest, bits of farmland, lots of open meadowland, lots of oak woodland. And of course, most of this was eliminated very rapidly, but some areas have been preserved in parks. The problem is that according to the charcoal record, for 9,000 years, these ecosystems were maintained with frequent fire. And so when you protect these areas and put them aside, you don't protect them in the state that they evolved in. And so a lot of protected areas that may have looked, in this example, like the one that's kind of in the lower right here, which is taken in the 1800s in the uplands. But this is what a lot of oak woodlands in the uplands would look like now. And so those diverse herbaceous understories and the meadowlands that supported the butterflies are not there anymore. And a lot of oak woodland has also, in the absence of fire, converted into closed Douglas fir forest, which is also not suitable habitat for butterflies or for all of the organisms that evolved in those habitats over the many thousands of years that frequent fire kept those habitats open. And so habitat protection and restoration is a non-trivial thing, a very important thing. But I don't want to dwell on it too much. I want to get back to things that you might do at your own home or plants that you might take a special interest in. I'm going to say a few words about host plants. And so before we start, let's call up another poll. This one is about which plants you think might be good host plants for butterflies. Host plants, again, being the plants that the caterpillars eat. So some important host plants for butterflies on Vancouver Island are, your choices are milkweed, mock orange, butterfly bush, asters, and nettle, meaning stinging nettle.
Okay, so again, we're getting up to 75% now have voted, so I'll just give it about 5 more seconds here.
All right, results coming in right now. And now let me go through these one by one. So about half of people chose milkweed. And milkweed gets a lot of press because it's the only host plant of the monarch butterfly. But milkweeds are not native to Vancouver Island. So Vancouver Island has never been a natural part of the monarch's breeding range. And so that one on Vancouver Island is not a particularly good choice for a host plant. Mock orange, 40% of people chose mock orange. Mock orange is a great nectar plant, particularly the bigger swallowtails like to visit mock orange, but it's not a host plant for any of our local butterflies. Similarly with butterfly bush, which only 16 people selected. Butterfly bush, again, produces a lot of nectar, but it's not a host plant. There's no local butterfly whose caterpillars feed on butterfly bush. And it's also can be a real problematic species when it escapes into natural areas. Asters, 64% of people chose asters. Asters are great nectar plants, and we also have at least one local butterfly whose caterpillars feed on aster, and that's quite a rare species. And so that's a nice choice. And then 76% of people chose nettle, which is the best choice on the list. And I'll say more about stinging nettle and the butterflies that feed on it in just a second. So let's go through some of the sort of standout host plants for southeastern Vancouver Island. First of all, ocean spray. Ocean spray, a big, beautiful shrub in the rose family, related to spireas. And we have 5 local butterfly species who use ocean spray as a host plant. The brown elfin, spring azure, Lorquin's admiral, and 2 of our swallowtail species. So none of these are restricted only to ocean spray. Some of them will use other related shrubs and trees, and some of them will use the bigger shrubs and trees in the willow family. But all of these will use ocean spray. Willows and poplars, another really good one. That's a trembling aspen there in the picture. Schooler's willow is also a great choice, which I didn't get a chance to snap a picture of. And so we have 6 species here whose host plants are willows and poplars. There's a certain amount of overlap here between the species that use ocean spray. But then there are some that are on this list that weren't on the previous, like the sylvan hairstreak, green comma, morning cloak. Green comma and morning cloak are both reasonably common species. Sylvan hairstreak is pretty uncommon. Stinging nettle. So we have 5 local butterflies that feed on stinging nettle. And some of these are some of our most common woodland butterflies. Some of them are our most common migratory butterflies. So the West Coast lady, painted lady, red admiral, those are all migratory species that expand up from the south every summer, and then they may or may not have a real 2-way migration. A lot of them just die when it gets cold, and then they get reduced back to their kind of core winter range in the southern US and northern Mexico. Satyr anglewing, which is the one in the lower left, is our most common nettle feeding butterfly. It's also usually the first butterfly to be seen in the spring. The earliest that I've seen one is February 2nd. And they're out so early because they hibernate as adults. And so they're spending the winter as a butterfly, in an old shed or under a slab of bark or in a wood pile. And then anytime that it gets warm enough for them to fly around, they'll come out in the spring. Sometimes people might see them or other butterflies that overwinter, like morning cloaks. Might even, if their hibernation site was in a particularly warm spot, you might even see them while there's still a bit of snow on the ground, especially in snowier places where there can still be snow on the ground after the spring has started to warm up. Most of them will fold the leaf in a characteristic way, and so they're really easy to find in the stinging nettle. And it's not as simple as the leaf just sort of being folded over like a piece of paper or rolled up. There are lots of nettle feeding moths that will do things like that. But the nettle feeding butterflies, they have a really kind of particular pattern that they follow. They start by notching the bottom of the leaf stalk so that the leaf dangles down. And then they cut little triangles out so that they can silk it into this kind of like pattern that's square in cross section. And then they hide inside the leaf like this satyr anglewing caterpillar is doing. And they eat it from the tip towards the base. And so the more they eat, the more this folded leaf turns into kind of a perfect little box like you see in the lower right there. And so that's a very easy pattern to spot if you're looking at a patch of nettles, and then you can lift it up and see if there's still a caterpillar inside it. Native legumes are a great choice for some of our native butterflies. These are for Southern Vancouver Island. These are the two that would be the highest on my list. We have a broadleaf lupin on the right and a purple pea vine on the left. And we have a whole lot of butterfly species that feed on native legumes. Some of these might be restricted to just lupins or just pea vines, and some of them might be quite generalistic on legumes. I should say that the garden variety lupins that are planted all over the highways on Vancouver Island do support populations of silvery blue, but it was really kind of a miss, because if it had been a native lupin, it probably would have supported all of the lupin feeding butterflies instead of just the one most generalist species. And likewise, we have a lot of introduced pea vines, but I've never seen any evidence that those support any of our native legume feeding butterflies that feed on the native purple pea vine. And so good to look for some of these native legumes. Grasses are one that people may not think about, and but we do have a whole bunch of butterfly species that feed on native grasses. This is a Romer's fescue growing in a dry spot, and you can see mostly moss around it. And a lot of grass-feeding butterflies, they aren't all very well known. There probably aren't any that feed on only one species of grass. They probably key really in on things like structure. And so there might be species that feed only on very fine-leaved bunch grasses like this fescue. And in places where more detailed research has been done, like with some of the rare butterflies of the United Kingdom, they've found that even the context that the grass is growing in makes a big difference. And so they might pick only a bunch grass that's a certain size and with a certain proportion of bare ground around it, while other species, some species might choose a small bunch grass surrounded by bare ground. Other species might choose tall broadleaf grasses in a denser sward. But we have a lot of grass feeding butterflies, and including a bunch of species that are quite rare. So now I think we're going to talk a little bit about identification and about some of the coarser groupings of butterflies in our area that you could learn to recognize. And so before we get into that, why don't we take a look at our third and final slide, the one to do with butterfly identification. Around how many butterflies can you confidently identify? Your choices are none, 1 or 2, 3 to 9, 10 to 20, or all of them. And we didn't specify any kind of geographical limits here, so I guess we'll just leave it open. Results are in. Almost half of you feel like you can identify 3 to 9 butterflies. That's pretty good place to start. There's 13% of people who are starting at the very beginning with none. 28% said 1 or 2. 9% said 10 to 20, and 4% said all of them, which is certainly a very ambitious statement. So let's talk about the families of butterflies that live in our area, which I think is a good place to start with identification. The first family is the Pieridae, which includes whites, sulfurs, orange tips, marbles, a few other things. This is a family of medium-sized butterflies that are all predominantly white or creamy or yellow, in color. It includes some really common species like the cabbage white in the top right, and also some very rare species. Sulfurs, like the one in the lower right, are species that we don't see a lot of around here. That's an orange sulfur, which is a rare migrant in the Victoria area. And in the mountains, you can often see western sulfur, which used to live in Victoria, but now is only found higher in the mountains. Some species of white have a lot of patterning on them, although they may just look white until they stop and land and you get a better look, like the pine white on the lower left. I just heard that, I think either yesterday or today, I heard of some pine white observations. That's a species that starts to come out about this time of year, and the lucky ones might hang on into September out in places like Isuk. Quite a diverse family in terms of their lifestyles and food requirements. You know, just on this page we have cabbage white, which feeds mostly on cabbage family plants, mustard family plants. The orange tip, likewise, but very different suite of mustard family plants. And then the pine white is feeding on the leaves of conifers, and the orange sulfur in the bottom corner is a legume feeder. Anyway, this family is pretty easy to recognize. Pale butterflies, medium-sized. Next up, we have the Lycaenidae. The usual common name for this family is the gossamer wings. And I don't know what gossamer wings refers to, what makes their wings more gossamer-y than other butterflies. But this family includes the blues, the hair streaks, the elfins, the coppers. They come in lots of different colors, but mostly relatively muted, lots of blue, gray, and brown species. These include some very common species, some very rare species. And if you look, you'll see that they all have basically the same face. They have a face that's kind of compressed from front to back. You know, the eyes are very tall and thin, as if the face is kind of pushed in. If you compare that to the whites that we saw a second ago, the face is very compressed, very distinctive. And then their size and shape of the butterflies is also quite distinctive. Some of them have tails coming off the back of the wings, making a sort of little distraction display to try to trick birds into attacking an expendable part of the animal. Some of them don't have tails. But those are the Lycaenids. One family that I think a lot of people recognize, having seen butterflies like this before, is Pollinator, the swallowtails. Now we have three species that really are very typical swallowtails in our area, the three that are there. So the top left is the western tiger swallowtail, and then right beside it is the very similar pale swallowtail. Now both of these species have these big, strong kind of tiger stripes that run sort of parallel to the body. If you can see my cursor here, there are these stripes that go like this and like this. And so they both have that, but our third swallowtail species down below, the Anise swallowtail, does not. And so it's pretty easy to recognize. But if you're trying to tell the top two apart, the western tiger swallowtail has a more yellow ground color. Its dark stripes are narrower. And then another key thing to look at is the last little pale cell right before the tail at the back of the wings, which is yellow in a western tiger swallowtail and orange in a pale swallowtail. And those are butterflies really of the summertime, of this time of year. And the Anise swallowtail down below is a butterfly that you can see, you know, from the spring into the end of the summer, so from about April to September. Now, these swallowtails form a very cohesive group, but there's another group that is also part of this family that doesn't seem to match, which is the Apollos, or Parnassians if you prefer. These again are big butterflies, but they don't have the tails coming off the back of the wings, and they don't have the typical yellowish and black patterning of swallowtails. They're big, kind of creamy or whitish, and often have areas of the wings that are transparent, like the wingtips in this Claudius Apollo. The Claudius Apollo is quite a common species, but it's a species of somewhat wetter habitats than most of Victoria, and so you have to go, typically a little bit higher in elevation or a little bit further up the island. There are very rarely records of Claudius Apollo, even on the Saanich Peninsula, but really if you want to expect to see one, you should look a little bit higher towards, Cobble Hill or higher in the mountains. The Nymphalidae, the brushfoots, is a really big butterfly family, and a family that at first glance, appears to have nothing in common. Some of them are very brightly colored, some of them are very brown or gray. The wing shape varies a lot, the positioning varies a lot, and so this is kind of like one way to know that it's a nymphalid is to just exclude the others. But the name brushfoots kind of suggests the one thing that they do all have in common. And to get a sense of it, you need to see them in this position. Because the one thing that I think that most people know about insects is that insects have 6 legs, right? But in these brushfoot butterflies, the first pair of legs is very reduced to a little pair of brush-like structures. And so whenever you see them in this position, they appear to have only 4 legs. And that's the one thing that everything in that family has in common. And then finally, the Hesperiidae, the skippers, very hairy, very thick-bodied, short-winged group of butterflies, and that are quite distinctive. And they divide into 2 groups. And so the 4 on the left belong to the so-called grass skippers, which are often kind of orangey. They can be lots of colors, but most of the ones in our area are kind of shades of dingy orange, and they hold their wings kind of half upright in a kind of distinctive way. And then the 3 down the right-hand side are all spread wing skippers, which hold their wings flat. And the spread wing skippers have really diverse range of host plants, and the grass skippers on the other side are really strongly associated with grasses and sometimes sedges. So that's just a quick introduction to the families of butterflies that occur in our area. And what I want to take you through now quickly is kind of a tour of where to look for butterflies for 1 year on southern Vancouver Island. So in the early spring, meaning like February or the very beginning of March, on the first warm days, you want it to get to an air temperature of about 11 or 12 degrees. And you want to go down into a woodland area and look for a sun trap, a place where there's kind of like an alcove of trees, where there's a space that's out of the wind, a sheltered space where the temperature can get a bit higher. And in those areas, you might expect to find some of these very earliest species that overwinter as adults, and so they're ready to come out as soon as the weather gets warm enough. Things like anglewing, satyr anglewing, green comma, morning cloak, Milbert's tortoiseshell. Those are all species that you can see very early in the year on southern Vancouver Island. I've seen a few of them in December. I've never seen one in January, but I know other people who have. And the earliest that I've seen any of these was a satyr anglewing on February 2nd in 1 year. So those would be the very, very earliest things to see. But then about halfway through March, in those same kinds of weather, those sunny days that are getting up to about 12 degrees, if you go up to the rocky hilltops, to these warm, very dry environments, then you'll start to see some of the first species to emerge having spent the winter in their chrysalis. And so some of these early species that you might see on our local hilltops, Moss's elfin is very early, spring azure and Sarah's orange tip. It's very common to see brown elfin as well. Any of these in kind of like from the middle of March on. And so you'd start seeing these in the middle of March, but you know, probably April is going to be more reliable. And then as the season starts to progress a little bit from April into May, so really like kind of halfway through the spring, these disturbed areas, you know, they're not great to look at. It's not what any of us necessarily want to see in our natural areas, but these can be very productive for butterfly watching in mid to late spring. And in these habitats, you often get sort of like some of the meadow species responding to the sunlight, but then some of the trees are still there, a lot of the shrubs are still there. And so you can get a huge range of butterfly species in those kind of conditions. Some examples of species that you might see: cedar hair streaks and pine elfins would both be coming from the trees that are left over and on the edges. Gray hair streaks and western tail blues would be responding to some of those native legumes and other things that have come up to take advantage of the sun. Then, as the spring starts to turn into the summer, you want to go back into the woodlands. You know, for us, the summer doesn't have a ton of butterfly diversity down here, but in the woodlands, that's where you'll find our big swallowtails, the western tire, the pale swallowtail, Lorquin's admiral, also one of the most common butterflies of the summer on southern Vancouver Island, and a species that you'll find on any woodland edge, any sunny place in the woodlands at this time of year. You'll find a male Lorquin's admiral guarding his territory. And if you walk down a sunny trail through a woodsy place, you'll find them just evenly spaced all down the trail, each guarding his own little section of trail. But in the summer on southern Vancouver Island, if you really want to see a lot of butterflies, you need to go up into the mountains, places like Mount Washington or Mount Coakley Arrowsmith or anything that's higher up. And in these areas, you know, the spring is just starting now. And so a lot of the species that we saw in Victoria in April, you can see higher up in the mountains in July. But then because the season is crunched, you get the spring species and then the summer species happening together. And then you also get some of the kind of oddities or specialties that you'll see mostly in the mountains. Anna's blue, the only blue that we have that has a lot of orange on it, is really a mountain species. Claudius Apollo and Western Meadow Fritillary, Great Arctic. These are species that you can see at low elevation, but you're much more likely to see them if you go into the mountains. And other species, Hydaspes fritillary, Bois de Val's blue, margined white. There's tons of species that the easiest way to see them is to go into the mountains in summer. And some of those trails can have really like a lot of butterflies compared to what we're seeing at low elevation at this time of year. And then as the summer draws to a close, you want to go back to the same rocky hilltops where at the beginning of the year you were seeing the Moss's elfin and the Sarah's orange tip. And at the late in the season, a lot of the migratory butterflies will start to congregate on these rocky hilltops. It's kind of the way that they find each other. Since they cover such vast distances, they need some way to meet up. And so they have kind of an unspoken agreement that they're going to meet on hilltop prominences. So go up Mount Ptolemy, Mount Doug on hot days late in the day in August and even September. And those are great places to see things like painted ladies and red admirals and West Coast ladies. And if you're lucky, one of our least common migrants, the American lady, can also be seen in those kind of habitats. And then after that, after September, any butterfly you see in the Victoria area, you're kind of lucky to see. I've seen red admirals, painted ladies, and satyr anglewings into November, but rarely. So that's a whole year of looking for butterflies on southern Vancouver Island. And now, just in my last few minutes, I just want to call your attention to a few books, some butterfly resources that you might like for our area. Guppy and Shepherd, Butterflies of British Columbia, great book, a coffee table book. This, for me, would be my go-to book for all, basic information about what are they, what do they eat, where do they live, kind of questions. John Acorn and Ian Sheldon, Butterflies of British Columbia from Lone Pine, is a good field guide because you can carry it easily, and the identification information is good. Butterflies of the Pacific Northwest, or in older editions, Butterflies of Cascadia by Robert Michael Pyle and Caitlin Labar, is really good because, of course, Bob Pyle is mostly an author, although he's a genuine butterfly expert, but he's also a professional author of prose and poetry, and so there's a lot of great stories and pretty language. So it's a nice book to just sort of read. It's focused on Washington and Oregon, but it works for southern BC. A lot of people ask about caterpillars, how to identify caterpillars. And of course, when you know that more than 90% of lepidopterans are moths, the first thing that you should assume is that any caterpillar that you see is a moth. But if it is a butterfly and you want to know how to identify it, this book by David James and David Nunnally, they reared from egg to adult all of the butterflies found in Washington, which includes the great majority or maybe all of the species found in southern BC. And so you can see pictures of all of the caterpillars from southern Vancouver Island for sure, butterfly caterpillars that is, in that book. Finally, of course, Mike Yip had self-published a number of bird books. He's a great photographer. And one year he started taking pictures of butterflies. And so that immediately progressed into, hey, why don't I write a butterfly book? And so he started asking me some questions about it. And then I had this big database and information that I wanted to share. And so I asked him if we might be able to work on it together. And so Vancouver Island Butterflies is the most local butterfly book that you can get. I made the range maps for all the butterflies, and in the hopes that people would look at the maps and say, oh no, I can find them in more places than that. And so I'm really happy to report that that's exactly what's happened. And yeah, it's really gratifying when somebody sends me an email and says, your map says that this species was extirpated from this location, but here's a photo of it that I took the other day. That's the best that I could hope for from putting those maps out there. And so that brings me to the end. And so I'll turn it back to our moderators for question period. Thank you all for listening.
Thanks, James. That was so fantastic. I definitely learn a lot every time I hear James talk about butterflies. So that was really cool. So yeah, we're going to get to questions ASAP so that we can answer as many as possible. So we're going to get started with the one at the top of the list. It's from Sarah, and she asks, does the variety of species observed reflect also the density of people who observe them? i.e., are there less observed in remote areas because there are less people to see them?
Yes, definitely that is true. And that map that I showed at the beginning, it had all those hot spots in the southern interior, but it also had some real hot spots in kind of unexpected places in northern BC. And some of those, like the Summit Lake area on the Alaska Highway, are places that were, somebody's kind of like, kind of their favorite spot. And so the numbers went up. But across southern BC, you know, there's a lot. I'm not going to say that there isn't more work to be done, but there has been an awful lot of sampling. And so in southern BC, I think that those concentrations are pretty genuine. But, you know, tons of unusual butterfly records come from the yards of butterfly experts because, you know, they're the ones who know what they're, you know, something really weird might have flown through 1,000 backyards, but the person who knows what it is and knows that it's significant is going to be the one who records it for sure.
Great, thank you. So the next one is, do you know where the name butterfly comes from? And does it have anything to do with butter?
I don't know the answer. And I would think that it doesn't have anything to do with butter. And I've heard a rumor that it's actually a corruption of a German word, but I don't know the answer.
Yeah, I Googled it and there wasn't a whole lot of definitive info about it. So still a mystery. If anyone has the answer, you can put it in the chat. So the next one from John, do any butterfly species stay in their pupae stage for more than a year, or is it always only part of a year?
There are definitely butterflies in other places that stay in their pupa for more than a year. There are definitely butterflies in very unpredictable arid habitats, like desert habitats, that may stay in their pupa for a number of years and emerge when the weather conditions are appropriate. Whether there are any local species that do that, I don't think that there are, but there is one local species, the Great Arctic, that has a 2-year life cycle. And so it spends its first winter as an egg and its second winter as a pupa. And so you would think that over time there would be some spillover from one year to the next somehow, but every Great Arctic record that has ever been from Vancouver Island is in an even numbered year. And so in even numbered years, the adults are in flight, and in odd numbered years, the caterpillars are feeding.
That's cool. Okay, and the next one's from Ariel. Are there any native willows appropriate for small backyards or native trees? Which ones might be appropriate for a small area? They said they're concerned with perimeter drains and driveways.
Yeah, that's a good question. The willows, I think that you would struggle to keep any willow small, but there's a lot of overlap between the species that feed on willows and the species that feed on the rose family. And so I mentioned the ocean spray, but you might try a smaller member of the rose family, like maybe hardhack, or maybe a Saskatoon might stay small enough. Saskatoons can get big, but I think that they would be easier to manage than a willow would be. Yeah, I think hardhack might be a good choice for a rose family shrub that stays small. And I keep saying rose family shrub, but I've never heard of any of these things using an actual rose. But Spirea is a lot like ocean spray. Saskatoons, a lot of these same species will also feed on fruit trees, which you may already have or already want. But apples and cherries and plums are all in the rose family.
Great. So the next question is, do you know any butterfly jokes?
No, I'd love to know a butterfly joke.
All right, everyone needs to put their butterfly jokes in the chat. Okay. And are moths just victims of bad PR? What is their role as pollinators, and should we be planting host plants for them too?
Yeah, definitely. Moths are victims of bad PR. You know, there's something like 17,000 moth species in the world. No, I'm missing a zero here. There's like 180,000 moth species in the world, and how many could you think of that are actually a pest of anything? You know, not a large percentage. Moths are incredibly diverse. You know, there are 10 times as many moth species as there are butterfly species. So if you think about all of the diversity in habitat and host plant and life cycle that butterflies have, you should multiply it by 10 for moths. And similarly, you know, we know a lot about rare butterflies. We know that we've lost a lot of butterflies, that a lot of butterflies are in bad shape. So I have to assume that moths being that much more diverse, that they must have that much more habitat specialization, and there must be many more rare and endangered moths that aren't studied closely enough. So yeah, I think, you know, the good news is that moths are so diverse, and that no matter what you're planting, you're planting a host plant for a moth, I'm sure. And so, you know, but anything that we can do to protect habitat, to restore habitat, to make sure that native plants remain on the landscape is going to also contribute to conservation of moths and other insects and other animals as well. And if you go out at night with a headlamp, you'll find that there are lots of moths that visit flowers at night. So some moths could be significant pollinators. There are also moths that fly in the day that visit flowers as well.
Cool. Well, more people researching moths is always helpful. So the next one's from Jan. How do you know how climate change is affecting the range of butterflies on the island?
Well, I don't know how climate change is affecting the range specifically on Vancouver Island. There was a long time ago, there was some research on in Western North America that concluded that it was kind of shoddy because it discounted the abundance of people across where people live across different gradients. But some of that research now has been really done a lot better in Europe and also in North America. And you know, there definitely are butterflies that are disappearing from the southern limits of their range. And there may also be some species that are expanding north, but specifically to Vancouver Island, I don't know. You know, what I would worry about for Vancouver Island would be some of our mountaintop species, because, you know, there isn't a ton of area above the tree line on Vancouver Island. And if it gets warm enough for all of those mountaintops to become forested, then we would lose a lot of mountain species that way. But I don't know, I don't have anything more definitive than that.
All right. Okay, so the next one's from Susan, and she asks, any tips for photographing butterflies?
Well, when you're looking for butterflies, you know, butterflies spend a lot of time basking. And so when you're looking for butterflies, you might not see them if they're facing the wrong way. You know, if you're looking at them from the wrong angle, you might be just looking at the edge of the wings and not really seeing them. And so the best way to look for butterflies is to look in the direction of your shadow. If you look in the direction of your shadow, then you'll see butterflies in the orientation that they're exposing to the sun. And so that's a good way to find them. And then my biggest tip for photographing butterflies is to approach them with your body low. To, you know, instead of walking very slowly towards them, kind of crouch and shuffle very slowly towards them. I think that keeping your body low makes a big difference to how close you can get. And you know, some species are more flighty than others. You know, there's species like the great Arctic, like they seem like they're afraid anytime that you get within, like, it's hard to get within about 5 meters of a great Arctic if it's basking. But some species are much more obliging. And sometimes if you can kind of like, if you spend enough time trying to photograph a species, you can get to know its habits pretty well. When I was working in the San Juans, there was one place that I went like every weekend trying to get good photos of the same species over and over and over again. And by the end of it, it got to where, you know, at one point I was trying to take the picture and I sort of was like repositioning its wing without it flying away. So sometimes it's just practice.
Nice. Okay, yeah, you'd have to be stealthy to get butterfly shots, I think. So the next one's from Anne Marie and asks, if you have limited space in your garden, is it better to focus on host plants or nectar plants?
Well, I guess it depends a little bit on if you have limited space, on what the surrounding space is. And so if the surrounding space was an area that was going to be safe, you know, I would always default in any butterfly garden or any conservation attempt, I would always default towards the host plants. That's the main thing that they can't live without. And so if you had a small garden, but it was surrounded by a relatively safe space where the caterpillar might walk off, and then I would say host plants. But if you have a small garden and what's around your garden is mowed lawn or a parking lot or something where a caterpillar or a pupa is not going to be very safe, then I would say focus on nectar plants, and then your space can be, you know, sort of a fueling station rather than a place where a whole life cycle happens.
Nice. Okay. Awesome. And then also, do you have any deer-resistant butterfly attracting native plants?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, there's a lot of, there are deer-resistant plants that are great nectar plants, like gumweed. And the butterflies whose host plants are grasses and sedges, those are host plants that are going to be, you know, pretty deer resistant. Deer don't pay a lot of attention to grasses. But most host plants are going to be somewhat deer sensitive. You know, I guess there are things like willows, things that are bigger, like willows, ocean spray, fruit trees, where there's a large part of the canopy is going to be above the danger zone. But for smaller and more lower lying things, I can't think of, aside from the grasses, many good deer resistant host plants.
In terms of
Deer-resistant,
nectaring plants, maybe like Douglas aster and pearly everlasting or something?
Early everlasting is a good one for sure. And Douglas aster is going to depend a little bit on the desperation level of your deer. Typically, Douglas aster or goldenrod will take some damage for half of the season, and then when they start to flower, they must become more distasteful, and then deer often leave them alone more once they start to flower.
Nice. Okay. So there's lots of questions, but we only have time for one more. There's a couple questions about using an app or an online database to help with identification and recording monitoring. Are there any resources like that you can recommend, James?
Yeah. If you just want to identify butterflies, then you could go to various platforms like Bug Guide, or you could scroll through butterfly section of efauna.bc.ca. But in terms of actually trying to sort of like manage and preserve data, then what I would really recommend is iNaturalist. And so you post a photo or an observation on iNaturalist, and then other people who know the species will confirm its identification, or maybe maybe you're posting it unidentified and they'll identify it for you. And then that point on the map is preserved forever as long as you don't delete it. And it can be part of projects. You could set up a project to document the butterflies of your area or whatever. But yeah, iNaturalist is a powerful tool. There's a lot of different things that you can do with it to help with identification and also to help with database.
Awesome. Okay, so we're going to wrap it up there. And if you have other questions for James, then there is a Facebook group called Saanich Native Plants Restoration, and maybe one of us will be able to share them with James via that, and Kristen. So we have a couple of awards for those of you that are still hanging on with us. So the Moderator's Choice was the beautiful greeting cards from Pollinator Partnership Canada. And there are all really good questions. I'm gonna pick John Pattison's question. Do any butterfly species stay in the pupae stage for more than a year? I thought that was a good one. So John, if you can send me a message in the chat, we'll get you in touch with Laura about the cards. And then the book that James provided, he asked for it to be a randomly selected participant who's still in the webinar. So I picked a random number generator, and I'm going to do a quick count. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10. Okay, and the winner is Jan Smith. So if Jan, if you're interested in the book, if you are able, and you're able to pick it up, if you could pop a comment in the chat or the Q&A, that would be super helpful. So if there's any other interest in future webinar series like this, we've got our upcoming webinars. You can check it out at islandpollinatorinitiative.ca for more info. And thank you so much, James, for your time and your awesome presentation.
You're welcome.
Laura, did you have anything else to add to wrap it up?
No, that's great. Just thanks so much, James. I, like Paige, I learned so much more every time I listen to you about butterflies. So thank you so much. And thank you, Paige, for introducing and moderating. Appreciate it. Yeah, and check out the next ones in the series, and we'll be doing them over the next few weeks, over the next month and a half. Thanks all.
Okay, well, fantastic. We will get all that wrapped up. All right. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great day.